Okay. So, good evening, everybody. And as I said, I want to thank Rabbi Raphael for joining us this evening. We both attended the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum last week. And it was my fourth time attending this program. It was Rabbi's first time. So I thought that, since he's the one who's sort of seeing this with new eyes, so to speak, I would ask him to share some thoughts and impressions first, and then I'll share some, and then we'll dialogue with each other and with you all as well. So, Rabbi, the floor is yours.
So I've been supporting AJC for probably 30 years or so. If you don't know the organization, they do worldwide advocacy for Jews and Jewish themes, Israel's right to exist and security, confronting anti-Semitism, upholding democratic values, and they do this through education, advocacy, and seeking to influence through relationship public opinion. So the forum was here last week, June 9 to 11th. They had 2,000 people at the hotel from 50 countries. I wasn't surprised to hear accented English from many places and a lot of Hebrew, but there was an awful lot of Spanish and even some Eastern European languages that I heard being spoken around the room. I went, and fortunately, as expected, I got some partial answers to the aftermath of October 7th. I was trying to find ways to grapple with the sadness and the pain, the depression, and the anger of the 7th itself, and the explosion of hate and anti-Semitism around the world, especially the viciousness of campuses, both high school and college, and the fears that have been engendered there. I'm not going to talk about the political networking around the world or the campus support work or the incredible support offered Jews around the world. I'm sure Rabbi Arian will cover a chunk of that. What energized me, though, and filled me with a sense of renewed mission were the stories of the heroes who spoke themselves or whose stories were told, and there were 4 of those stories. The last person who was honored was Ophir Libstein. He was the mayor of a town near Gaza called Kfar Aza, and he's famous as the first person publicly identified as murdered on October 7th. 3 other members of his family, a son-in-law, his son Nita, who fell on a grenade to save other family members, and the spirit light of the family, his 25-year-old son Nitzan, were also murdered. But that's not the story as painful as it is. Ophir was a long-term partner of American Jewish Committee, a teacher, a co-worker, an advocate with relationships around the world, Jewish and non-Jewish, doing the things that AJC does. In honor of all that work and in his memory, at this meeting, the AJC created an Ophir Libstein Bridge Building Award to be able to continue the work that he'd done for decades. So my first thought is, what do you do with death? Senseless death on some level. Well, we transcend death with memory and with charity, which enables the memory of the goodness to live on. And I think that's the first teaching. The second one, not in order, of the people who were viewed as heroes, is Nasrin Youssef. She lived 3 miles from Gaza and Moshav Yated. She and her husband are Druzim. Her husband is an IDF officer. They have 4 kids, 14, 12, 10, and 3. When the code red came in that morning on Shabbat, they went to their safe room. But a few minutes later, after talking with his commanders, her husband, dressed in his uniform, went out so that he wouldn't be a mouse in the face of everything that was happening. She, in Arabic, offering money and protection, took 4 terrorists into hiding with her as things turned against the Hamas. And she directly and in phone conversations with the commander back in Gaza garnered information which helped the IDF locate terrorists and prevent any larger disaster. It was very eerie when she spoke about how the terrorists described how they had been guaranteed $5 to $25 for every Jew that they killed. It's a horrible description of the value of human life to Hamas. What struck me, beside her fluent Hebrew, which didn't surprise me all that much, was not just her courage, but her deep love for Israel, her faith that nothing like this will ever happen again, and her hope for Israel alive and someday at peace. Coming from a non-Jewish citizen of Israel, This true heroine gave me a great deal of hope. The third were a couple, spoke beautiful English because they've lived in the United States for decades. They've actually from Plainview, Long Island, Orna and Ronan Nutra. Their son Omer made Aliyah a couple of years ago and was a tank squad commander during the attack. He was taken, though, hostage and is believed to still be alive as a hostage in Gaza. As we listened to them tell the story, you couldn't truly imagine, but you could empathize with the anguish they articulated. They used to tell their story themselves. They imagined what he was going through and what he might be saying. Could he be able to share the physical and emotional horror that they were imagining? So what are they doing? They go to consulates in New York and embassies in DC and advocate for all the remaining hostages to be released. They ceaselessly try to bring pressure on Hamas that all 120 hostages, those remaining alive and those who are already deceased, be returned to Israel. They are not paralyzed by fear or sadness. They have found the strength to do everything in their power to achieve Omer's return home, and the same for all the remaining hostages. Last, actually was second in the program, were Tzvi and Dorit Redder from Kibbutz Sad. Their son Dov, 22 years old, was in Kibbutz Beri, not far from them, where he and his 18-year-old girlfriend were working with special needs children. Both were murdered, although they did not know that truth for 9 days after October 7. Tzvi is an EMT and Dorit is a nurse, and they helped save dozens of souls from the supernova concert slaughter. But what they've done with their horrible tragedy is more important. They created tzedakah in Dov's memory. It's called We Are Winning a Generation. Again, in the face of death, we try to bring light and hope. They said it themselves in Hebrew in their talk. Hamas tried to bring death and darkness. We, Israel and Jews, seek light and hope. So for me, this going to this convention, a conference, summit, whatever you'd like to call it, was a celebration of Israeli and Jewish resilience. It's been a very hard 9 months watching the news in Israel, in the United States, and around the world. Israel is not caving in, and the American Jewish community and central institutions are in firm support of seeing the hostages released and home. These stories restore my faith. They break through the feeling of isolation that we often feel. They enable us not to be surrounded and overwhelmed by angst, and encourage us to simply go back to keep doing the right thing. And so, as almost all the speakers ended their talks, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, and we shall continue to live.
Yasher Koach. I appreciate what you said. I have to say that for me, the sort of emotional high point of the program was also Tzvi and Dorit Reeder in particular. Which was interesting because there were a lot of high-powered politicians and other mockers from all over the world. And Tzvi and Dorit, I mean, the fact, for example, that they addressed the conference in Hebrew, which I take it to mean that they're not fluent in English, because most Israelis are, at least somewhat fluent in English. And you could just tell by their bearing and their mannerisms that these are, salt of the earth people. They're kibbutzniks. Dorit is actually born on the kibbutz. Tzvi from Jerusalem, originally went to the kibbutz when he married Dorit. But you could tell these are anashim pshutim, simple people. And their talk was so emotional. I sent out, a link to a video of their talk. And if you haven't watched it, it's 9 minutes. It's absolutely worth the 9 minutes.
It is transliterated. It translated.
Yeah, there's subtitles. It's worth the 9 minutes. But the fact, as far as I could tell, received the loudest and longest ovation of the entire program. Which says something not only about them, but about the people who were attending. What was interesting for me, so a little bit of sort of history and background. Okay, the American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906 as a response to the Kishinev pogrom, in particular, in what was then Tsarist Russia. Kishinev is now in Moldova, but then it was part of Tsarist Russia. And their goal at the time was to get the U.S. government to try and intercede with the Tsar to stop the pogroms. They were mostly Jews of German background, and wealthy American Jews of German background. Many of these were the same people who were on the board of the Jewish Theological Seminary at the time. And if you see some of these names, and then you go to JTS, you see those names on the pillars in the courtyard and so on and so forth. Louis Marshall and Sulzberger and Cyrus Adler, the same names. And what's interesting is that, to me anyway, their involvement with JTS was in some ways motivated by the same sort of feelings of noblesse oblige, because they were not conservative Jews, they were Reform Jews, right? So if they were Reform Jews, why were they involved with JTS? Well, if you want to be charitable, you say that they understood that the immigrants and the first generation children of immigrants were not going to be attracted to Reform Judaism. Conservative Judaism, was familiar enough, similar enough, certainly liturgically, to Orthodoxy, that this could be kind of an Americanizing influence for them. And so out of that charitable impulse, they supported a movement which they themselves were not part of. If you want to be less charitable, you could say that, they wanted to provide something else, lest these dirty, smelly Eastern European Jews start joining Reform temples, right? And then we have to pray with them and, but that same sort of noblesse oblige. And there are things that still, to me at least, reflect the Central European as opposed to Eastern European origins of the AJC. The fact, for example, I actually, and I have to apologize, Rabbi, I oversold it to you. I said that the sessions begin on time and end on time. They actually tended to begin about 2 minutes late, as opposed to every other Jewish conference I've ever attended, where they begin 10, 15, 20 minutes late, right? It runs on time, right? And you never see that at any Jewish conference. I don't know which ones you've attended, but you've certainly been at RA conferences over the
love
years and
Yekas.
whatever.
Yekas are great.
Yeah. So there is still that, even though I kind of assume at this point that, the majority of members of AJC are, Litvaks or Galicianers like we are, but they're still, and the other thing, I have to say that this kind of, I don't know, it really stood out to me perhaps more than it should, but during the morning plenum on Monday, right? They're always trying to build interest. So a special announcement, okay? The current executive or the CEO of AJC is Ted Deutsch, who was a member of Congress from South Florida for several terms, gave up his seat in Congress to take over as CEO of the American Jewish Committee, which tells you something about the power and prestige behind AJC. But so they're making a special announcement about this new program that they're launching in partnership with the Jewish Agency. Okay, the Jewish Agency is, if you don't know what it is, it's officially not part of the Israeli government, but it promotes Zionism and Israel throughout the world. What is this special initiative that they are so proudly unfurling? The Jewish Agency is paying for, and AJC is training. All right, there's this thing called Shin Shinim. Shin stands for Shnat Sharut, a service year. And you can, if you're chosen to participate in a program like this, you can delay your IDF service by a year and be sent overseas to work as a volunteer in a diaspora Jewish community. Okay, I don't think we have Shin Shinim here in DC. When I was in Eastern Connecticut, which is a small, remote community, we didn't qualify for like grown-up emissaries. We would have Shin Shinim every year. So what is this new program for the Shin Shinim? They're going to send them to the United States to be placed in private non-sectarian schools. Okay, because there's a problem of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism in these schools, the various Tony private schools here in DC, like Sidwell Friends or whatever. So, and I have to say, as somebody who grew up in a lower middle class household in New Jersey, placing emissaries in private schools, if you said to me, name the 100 most important things to do for the American Jewish community, I'm not sure that placing Israeli emissaries in private schools would be on that list of 100 most important things, right? But there are a lot of people in the American Jewish Committee who have a lot of money, who are sending their kids not to day schools, but to these Tony, expensive private schools. So they're serving their constituency, and that's great. I'm not sure it merited this whole big we're rolling out, but it says something about the American Jewish Committee to this day. So I went back. One of the things that I love about the fact that I use the Google Suite for all my writing. So every email that I've sent since 2005, I still have. Every bit of writing that I've done since 2005, I still have. So I went back because I did a Kiddush conversation in 2016, following the AJ Committee Global Forum then. And I found, interestingly enough, that a lot of the same themes that I spoke about in 2016 are still like key in 2024. All right. I attended a panel of forget exactly what it was called. Hold on, I'll find it. Global Perspectives on the U.S. Presidential Election. Okay, so there were speakers from, there was a speaker from Germany, from Poland, from Turkey, and one other country I forget. Okay, and here's what they were all concerned about. The fear, or I would say not even fear, but the certainty that if Trump wins in November, oh yeah, the speaker from Ukraine, if Trump wins in November, the United States will become isolationist and withdraw from being involved in international affairs. Ukraine is gone, and the US commitment to NATO is gone, and that Russia will have a free hand to concoct whatever mischief they want to concoct without an American counterbalance to them. With the possible exception of Israel, right? Because Trump is sort of known to be pro-Israel. But if you look, for example, at the primary in Virginia, that's still not decided, right? And AIPAC gave money to the candidate running against Congressman Good. Why? Because Congressman Good voted against the supplemental appropriation to Israel. Now, why did Congressman Good, who is the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, right? He'll say all the right pro-Israel things, but he is opposed to foreign aid, period. Okay, and therefore is not going to support foreign aid to Israel either, because he doesn't believe that American money should be spent to help other countries, right? So that is a fear that was very prominent in 2016, and it's a fear that's prominent in 2024. Concerns about anti-democratic trends in Israel under Netanyahu. And I have to say, I mean, I give AJC credit, is that they are one of the few American Jewish organizations that is willing to speak up when they perceive the Israeli government is acting in an anti or non-democratic way. And this goes back a long time, because there's another theme that came up fairly frequently, is that human rights and democracy are indivisible, right? And that the welfare of the American Jewish community cannot be separated from the welfare of all other minority communities, whether that's African Americans or Latinos or the LGBT community or even Muslim Americans. And the AJC does have a Jewish Muslim alliance that is, fraying, but is still intact, right? Because, if the rights of any minority are not protected, then the rights of all minorities are not protected. And that was a very prominent theme that came up. And the last thing it came up both Sunday night and Monday morning. All right, Sunday night there was a panel of Jewish leaders from different countries, okay, including the chairperson of the South African Jewish community. It's interesting to me how many of the elected leaders of Jewish communities around the world are now women. So the elected leader of the South African Jewish community, a woman, was one of the panelists. The elected leader of the Chilean Jewish community, a woman, was one of the panelists. And the president of the European Union of Jewish Students, a graduate student woman from France, was also on the panel. And one of the things that she said that actually got a lot of applause was, we students understand what is going on our campuses, okay? And you need to trust us and let us decide how things ought to be handled, rather than parachuting in externally and sort of, taking over or, telling us what to do. And then Monday morning, there was a special breakfast for rabbis only. And the three speakers were two college students and one high school student, college student from Columbia and from, can't remember if it was University of Chicago or Northwestern, but one of the schools in Chicago. And, they both said the same thing. I mean, it was very interesting to me. I mean, interesting to me also as somebody who started my career as a Hillel director. And I felt at the time that there was no campus situation that could not be made worse by the involvement of the ADL. And, they said, yes, there are troubling things going on campus, but the Jewish students who are involved in anti-Israel and anti-Zionist activism, it is a tiny percentage of the Jewish students on campus. The Jewish communities are thriving. They're still unified. They're still together. Participation in Hillel and Chabad is higher than it's ever been. And when we tell you what's going on our campus and what we need, please listen to us. Don't come in and hold press conferences that blow up alliances that we've made. Don't come in and have press conferences that create a false picture of what's really going on. We're the ones, who have to live with the results of what you do. And we know better than anybody else what's really going on campus and what's really needed on campus. And you could pick up from that and from some of the other comments that there's a bit of a rivalry between AJC and ADL on some of this stuff. Because the fact of it's not nice to say, but if anti-Semitism in America were to magically disappear overnight, everybody who works for the ADL would be out of a job. Whereas the AJC would still have a role because it is involved internationally and not just on the American scene. So that student panel was pretty impressive. The last program that I'll talk about, because I found it really interesting, So there was a program called After the Golden Age of American Jewry. If you recall, Franklin Foer wrote a cover story in the Atlantic a couple of months ago where he said the golden age of American Jewry is over. Okay, we have enjoyed a golden age for the last 100 years. And what made that golden age possible was the very low levels of anti-Semitism in American society, resurgence of anti-Semitism. The golden age is over. And he actually served as the moderator of this panel of few other people, two people from the AJC and one other person. And in the context of this, they released a survey that they had done fairly recently. The survey was taken in 2024, so all post October 7th. And here are some of the key findings of that survey. All right, 85% of American Jews believe it is important for the US to support Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. 87% of American Jews think that anti-Semitism has increased in the US. Now, key finding, 57% of American Jews feel more connected to Israel or their Jewish identity compared to before October 7th. Okay, more than 1 in 10 American Jews have ended a friendship or relationship because the person expressed anti-Semitic views. 9 in 10 American Jews believe anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States. 49% feel safe attending synagogue or the JCC. 27% feel unsafe. Okay, now, regarding the 2024 elections, 61% plan to vote for Biden, 21% plan to vote for Trump. When asked who is better for the US-Israel relationship, about 65% said Biden. Who is better at fighting anti-Semitism? Also, about 65% said Biden. American Jews, a majority approve of Biden's performance. A majority, but just barely, approve of his handling of the war. 72% say that being Jewish is important to them, and less than 10% have considered leaving the United States because of anti-Semitism. And those poll results were kind of, and here I really actually will wrap up my prepared remarks. On Tuesday morning, right? Tuesday morning, the last plenary of the Global Forum, they always have what's called the Great Debate. Okay, and unfortunately, they're always trying to jam a ton of stuff in. So even though the plenary is like 2 hours, this segment of it, the Great Debate, is only about 20 minutes, right? And the Great Debate this time was, who should Jews vote for, right? Biden or Trump? And it was made, quite clear as it was made in, the panel overseas looking at the American elections, that the AJC is a 501c organization, does not endorse candidates. Okay, Similarly, Kehilat Shalom is a 501c. We do not endorse candidates. And I have never endorsed a candidate, although if you know me, you can usually tell, who I, as a private individual, plan to vote for. But so the great debate was Trump or Biden. The Trump speaker was Morgan Ortagus, who was the State Department spokesperson towards the end of the Trump administration. The Biden spokesperson was Haley Soifer, who is the head of the Jewish Democratic Council. And, I would say subjectively, but not even that subjectively, the Biden spokesperson got a lot more applause than the Trump spokesperson, which, if this debate had been held at AIPAC, would absolutely not be the case. And I have to say, I mean, and this came up in the overseas panel, right? And you have heard me say this, okay? Every 4 years, Jewish Republicans say, this is finally the year when American Jews will wake up and vote Republican. And every 4 years, 80% of Jews vote Democratic. And I see nothing, frankly, that's going to change that this year, because even though Trump may be marginally more pro-Israel, our thriving in this country depends on the preservation of democracy. I mean, to me, as far as, again, this is not an endorsement, right? But to me, and I was actually called by a poll taker yesterday, and she read a whole bunch of issues and says, which of these is most important? And I said, none of them. Preservation of democracy. To me, that is the only issue in 2020. That's the only issue. But anyway, so Rabbi, do you want to add anything, based on either something that occurred to you or my remarks?
Just one other session that I watched the video of, which was just some Israeli journalists talking about what do we do with what's happening. And there were several senses that were significant. One, this is really an existential crisis in Israel because of the loss of sense of security, and raised questions about what the future is going to be like and all of the internal political issues coming up. How will the reality of October 7th reflect on the great divide that exists internally within Israel? The second issue that someone raised, which is really important, is with everything going on with the Abraham Accords, is there a chance out of this crisis that there could really be a day after, which would be more peaceful, to which no one knows the answer, but which the journalists are grappling with from what they're hearing and seeing? And the other thing that was very striking, I'm not surprised that any columnist wouldn't say this, but there's a real crisis of leadership within Israel as of this point in time. And the war has brought out the enthusiasm, the intelligence, the courage of Israeli youth. Well, that will be revealed and experienced in the next election, where new leadership may be engendered, was a question that the journalists were asking of each other. I thought that was significant. So the crisis of security, the hope for a day afterward, and the hope for a better leadership are all things that I think we sense as we study what's going on in Israel, and hope that Israel will find its way, as we in America also will find its way, to dealing with our internal and external crises.
All right, so throw it open. Comments, questions, thoughts, rebuttals. So I'm kind of disappointed in you. Like you usually got some.
Just a quick aside then, just something else that was interesting to me. They had the president of Brandeis University, the president of Michigan on, and they did a nice nuanced, I think, approach to the tension between freedom of speech, academic freedom, and when does speech cross over into harassment and different kinds of things. But I was really pleased to hear them talk about BDS as a form of anti-Semitism. And both were able to articulate that. And how did they articulate it? What other immoral regime is facing BDS from organizations in this country? And obviously the answer is only Israel faces BDS. And the only other country that's ever faced BDS, from my perspective, was South Africa decades ago. And if we're in academic settings where BDS is being done, sanctions don't work against South Africa. They don't work against Israel, and they're certainly not working against Russia right now. So if you're open academically to studying what's going on, BDS makes no sense. It is only a form of hatred and bigotry and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I would actually disagree with you on one point. I mean, I think sanctions did actually cause the South African apartheid regime to collapse. But South Africa was far more isolated than Israel is. And you know, but beyond that, absolutely. I mean, you know, if you're talking about, you know, avoiding contact with the Israeli government, that's one thing. But when you're talking about, we don't want students from our university to be allowed to study abroad in Israel, right? We don't want Israeli students to be able to study here. We don't want academic exchange programs with Israel. We don't want, you know, Israeli musicians, right? Like my cousin Matan Klein is one of Israel's top jazz musicians. Okay, but he's not. I mean, to which you could say, okay, how many, top Israeli jazz musician, right? That's like, you know, I am the best basketball player in my home. Um, but um, but he's a world-class jazz musician. He travels all over the world, right? And he's a progressive. I mean, you know, he plays every Saturday night. He plays for the Havdalah at Kikar Hatufim, the protests, you know, which are now against Netanyahu, and so on and so forth. And to say that my cousin Matan shouldn't be allowed to, you know, perform, that's crazy. That is, I mean, it's anti-Semitic, and it's also counterproductive because you know, the most progressive sectors of Israeli society, right, are the professors and the artists, as in any society, right? So, you know, so on the bigger question, I absolutely agree with you. And you know, and I think it's also, I mean, but they also both said, this is my personal feeling. I mean, you know, it's really important that when you are evaluating, you know, these campus protests and whatever, the rules have to be content neutral, right? I mean, you know, which I have to say a lot of American Jews don't actually agree with. They want to make, you know, they want to make things illegal based on the perspective that is expressed rather than the actions that are, you know, breaking laws. You know, and if you could, frankly, if you could make support for the Palestinians illegal, right, then 5 years from now, you know, a president AOC could make support for Israel illegal. I mean, it has to be based on, you know, is it allowed to camp out overnight in the quad? And the answer is no, and the no has to be regardless of what is the cause you're supporting by breaking that rule. Anything else? Yeah, Sue, thank you.
Well, you were talking about, freedom being the most important thing, which I agree with, but I feel like, granted, Trump did move, the embassy acknowledged Jerusalem, which a lot of people disagree with. I think there's pros and cons, but I feel like ever since the primaries and the running during the last election of Trump, that freedom has gone down the tubes. I mean, what was it today? Louisiana said that there has to be a picture or a poster of the Ten Commandments in every college and every classroom. And then, of course, we have the abortion situation. And, it's like all of these people that were afraid Sharia law would be in force are making their own type of law in force, and individual freedoms for people that don't believe that way are just, like you wonder how long it's going to take to redeem all those freedoms that people in the 60s. I mean, I was not a marcher in the 60s, but I was at the University of Maryland, and I sure remember protests and the long road people had to go through to get a lot of those freedoms. And it seems like it took so long to get them, and they are, snuffed out in no time at all. So that's what I'm a little disturbed about.
Right. I mean, I would say, and to get back to a point that I made, that every 4 years, the Republican Jewish coalition says this is finally the year when American Jews will wake up and vote Republican, and then every 4 it doesn't happen. Is because a lot of politicians think that Jews are one-issue voters, and we're not. We're not. I mean, the number of times that I have, paid a sort of courtesy call on, my representative or my state legislature, not so much here in Maryland, actually, where I guess we have a more sophisticated, class of representatives, but, they start talking to me about Israel, and I'm like, I'm actually not here to talk about Israel. I'm here to talk about, reproductive freedom, or I'm here to talk about, making healthcare affordable, or whatever it is. And they, all they want to talk about is Israel, right? And we're not one-issue voters. I mean, I could not vote for a candidate who was, as anti-Israel as, let's say, Jamal Bowman. Okay. I mean, I think there has to be a sort of, bottom line support for Israel's right to exist and right to defend itself. But once that sort of litmus test has been made, then I'm looking at, the whole panoply of issues facing American society, because it is indivisible. So, absolutely. And I think that, I strongly predict that the Republican Jewish coalition is going to be disappointed again this year. I mean, they may be happy, but they're going to be disappointed in our community. I mean, I make no predictions as to the outcome of the election, but I think I'm on solid ground in making a prediction about the voting patterns of American Jews. So yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Anyone else? All right. If not, Rabbi, thank you for joining us. And thanks everybody. And Shabbat Shalom. And see you next year.